March 17, 2023, Raleigh, North Carolina. The courthouse steps are crowded. Reporters press shoulder to shoulder, microphones thrust forward, the chill of an early spring morning clinging to the air. Camera shutters click like rapid-fire gunshots, each flash illuminating a decades-long nightmare finally crawling into the light. At the center of it all, two uniformed deputies guide a gray-haired man in handcuffs down the steps. His face is pale, sunken, the face of someone who spent more than 60 years hiding from something, only to watch the walls finally close in. A voice cuts through the chaos, a woman's voice, trembling but steady. "That's him, that's the man who killed my sister." Gasps ripple through the crowd, but the man doesn't flinch. He keeps his head down, his jaw tight, refusing to meet her eyes. 43 years ago, this case shattered a quiet North Carolina town. 43 years of unanswered questions, whispered rumors, and families haunted by what ifs. And now, in a single moment, the past has come roaring back. Inside the courthouse, the hallway hums with tension. Family members sit in wooden benches worn smooth by time, hands clasped tight, knuckles white. Some have waited their entire adult lives for this day. Others never lived to see it. At the front, a small woman in her late 50s wipes her eyes with a trembling handkerchief. Her name is Linda Harris, and in 1980, she was just 15 when her older sister, Caroline, was murdered. 4 decades, Linda kept a photograph tucked inside her wallet, a faded Polaroid of Caroline, smiling beneath the summer sun, hair pulled back with a blue ribbon. Every birthday, every holiday, Linda lit a candle for her sister. And for 43 years, she carried a question no one could answer. Who did this to her? Now, as deputies lead the suspect into the courtroom, Linda whispers under her breath, "I never thought I'd live to see this." The prosecution table is stacked with thick binders, yellowing files, and a small cardboard box sealed with red evidence tape, a box that's been waiting, silently, in the dark for 4 decades. Inside is the fragment of truth that changed everything, a single DNA sample, recovered from beneath Caroline's fingernails in 1980, finally matched through modern genealogy databases. It wasn't technology they had in 1980. It wasn't even a possibility. But time, and science, caught up. Outside, the crowd grows restless. One of the local TV anchors leans into the camera, her voice low and deliberate. After more than 4 decades of dead ends and unanswered questions, investigators say a single DNA match has cracked one of North Carolina's most haunting cold cases. The suspect sits now in the defendant's chair, hands cuffed, shoulders rigid. His eyes flicker briefly toward the gallery, toward Linda, toward the other family members, toward the past he's spent a lifetime trying to bury. The bailiff calls for order, but there's a current of energy in the room that won't be silenced. It's not anger. It's not relief. It's something heavier, something caught between grief and vindication. 43 years ago, Caroline Harris's murder ripped the heart out of a small town. Back then, she was just 21. She had dreams, plans, a life ahead of her. That life ended on a quiet July night in 1980, along a wooded trail just outside Durham. Her body was discovered the next morning. The investigation that followed was exhaustive, relentless, and, eventually, fruitless. Evidence degraded. Witnesses moved away. Leads dried up. The case went cold. Until one detective, years later, long after most had given up, decided to pull the old files out of storage. He sent what was left of the evidence to a lab specializing in advanced DNA genealogy. For months, there was nothing. Then one email changed everything. A partial familial match. A name that tied, faintly but undeniably, back to someone the investigators had overlooked all those years ago. Someone they thought couldn't possibly be involved. Today, that man is sitting in this courtroom, staring at the polished wooden floor beneath his feet. Today, justice feels closer than it ever has. But the road to this moment wasn't simple. It wasn't clean. It was built on false leads, shattered trust, and 4 decades of secrets buried deep in a North Carolina town that's never truly recovered. And while one arrest can change everything, it also opens old wounds. Linda clutches the faded Polaroid in her hand, whispering softly to herself, "We finally got you, Caroline. We finally got him." Durham County, North Carolina, summer, 1980. The world looked different back then. Gas was 86 cents a gallon, the radio played Fleetwood Mac on repeat, and in this small town just outside Durham, folks still left their doors unlocked at night. For Caroline Harris, life felt like it was just beginning. At 21 years old, Caroline had a way of walking into a room and making everyone feel like they belonged there. She had a quick laugh, the kind that bubbled up from deep inside and made people laugh along even if they didn't know the joke. Her friends described her as the glue of their group, the one who remembered birthdays, organized beach trips, and checked in when someone went quiet for too long. A young woman full of dreams. Caroline was working part-time as a waitress at Miller's Diner, saving up for nursing school in Raleigh. Her dream, she told anyone who would listen, was to become a pediatric nurse. I want to help people, she told her best friend, Sharon Price, one humid evening in June 1980. Little kids, especially. They don't always get a voice, you know? I want to be that voice for them. Her mother, Margaret Harris, remembers those conversations vividly even decades later. She had this fire in her, Margaret says in an old interview, her hands folded in her lap. Caroline wasn't just smart, she cared. That was her gift. She'd spend her last dollar buying crayons for the neighbor's boy just 'cause she heard he liked to draw. Caroline kept a spiral notebook tucked under her mattress filled with doodles, little poems, and plans for her future. She wanted to move to the city but never lose the sense of community she grew up with. Durham, back then, was a place where you knew every face at the grocery store and every passing car on the dirt roads. Her quirks and quiet rituals. Caroline had little quirks her friends still talk about today. She drank her coffee black with 2 sugars, wore mismatched socks on purpose, and had a habit of twirling her necklace whenever she was deep in thought. Every Friday night, after her shift at the diner, she'd park her old rust-red Chevy Nova under the oak tree by the river and watch the sunset alone. Sharon once asked her why. Because it reminds me, Caroline said softly, that no matter what's going wrong in the world, there's still beauty out there. I don't want to forget that. These small details are the pieces left behind, the fragments family and friends hold onto like lifelines. The people who loved her. Caroline was the oldest of 3 siblings. Her younger sister Linda, 15 at the time, idolized her. She was like my second mom, Linda recalls. She'd sit with me and paint my nails, tell me to always stand up for myself. She just had this way of making you feel like you mattered. Their younger brother, Tommy, was only 9 when Caroline died. He barely remembers her voice now, but he still keeps a small keychain she gave him for his birthday, a plastic baseball glove she won at the county fair. Caroline had a boyfriend back then, Mark Ellison, a mechanic 2 years older than her. They weren't serious, friends say, but he was someone she laughed with, someone she trusted. Years later, Mark would describe her as sunlight, plain and simple. She just lit people up. A safe town, until it wasn't. In 1980, Durham County was the kind of place where danger felt far away. People left their windows open at night, unlocked their cars at the grocery store, and kids played outside until the street lights buzzed on. But there were rumblings, whispered stories of a man in a beat-up blue Ford seen cruising slowly past the diner late at night, of footsteps heard on quiet back roads where no one was supposed to be there. Caroline mentioned it once to Sharon in passing. Feels like somebody's been watching me when I leave work, she said, brushing it off with a laugh. Probably just my imagination. Sharon didn't think much of it at the time. None of them did. Why her death broke the town. When Caroline's life was stolen, it wasn't just her family who grieved, it was the entire community. People still talk about how the diner closed for a week, how the church held 3 separate prayer vigils, how the Harris family's front porch filled with casseroles and sympathy cards. Margaret Harris said it best in an old interview from 1981. When you lose a child, the world stops. But when a whole town loses someone like Caroline, it's like the air changes. Nothing feels safe anymore. Caroline's funeral drew nearly everyone from the county. People stood shoulder to shoulder under the heavy July sun, clutching tissues and fans, while the preacher's voice cracked trying to make sense of something senseless. Linda remembers standing there, numb, watching her sister's coffin lowered into the ground. I kept waiting for someone to say there'd been a mistake, she whispered. Like she'd come walking up the hill smiling, saying she was fine. That moment, that shattering of innocence, changed Durham County forever. Foreshadowing without giving it away. Years later, investigators would quietly revisit who Caroline knew and who she trusted. There was the regular customer at the diner who always sat at the counter and stayed until closing. The co-worker who'd once gotten too friendly after a Friday shift. A neighbor who offered to walk her home more than once. But back then, no one suspected anything. To everyone who loved her, Caroline was just living her life, dreaming of nursing school, saving up tips, and planning a weekend trip to Myrtle Beach with Sharon. The future seemed wide open. And that's what makes what happened next so unbearable. The stakes. Caroline's story is more than a statistic. She wasn't just another victim of a violent crime. She was someone's sister, someone's daughter, someone's first love. When she died, it left a hole that 4 decades of time couldn't fill. Her mother, Margaret, passed away in 1999 without ever knowing what happened to her oldest child. Her father, Harold, died in 2007, still setting a plate for Caroline every Thanksgiving, just in case she came home. Linda, now in her late 50s, says, "You don't get over something like this. You just carry it with you." By the summer of 1980, the stage was set. Caroline Harris was a young woman with dreams, a town wrapped in the illusion of safety, and shadows creeping closer than anyone realized. Because on a quiet July night, somewhere along a wooded trail outside Durham, Caroline crossed paths with a predator. And within hours, everything changed. July 11, 1980, Durham County, North Carolina. The sun rose early that Friday, spilling light across the Harris family's small, white-paneled home at the edge of a quiet road lined with tall Carolina pines. It was already hot by 8 a.m., the air thick with humidity that clung to skin and slowed every movement. Inside, Caroline Harris stood at the kitchen sink, washing her coffee mug, humming softly to the radio as Fleetwood Mac's "Saw" played in the background. She had the day carefully planned, a short shift at Miller's Diner, a quick stop by Sharon's house, and later, maybe, a drive out to the river to watch the sunset. It was supposed to be an ordinary day. 8:32 a.m., breakfast conversation. Linda Harris, 15 at the time, remembers watching her sister tie her hair back in a blue ribbon before heading out the door. She looked happy, Linda recalls. She always looked like she had somewhere to be, something to look forward to. Caroline grabbed her purse, kissed her mom on the cheek, and called out over her shoulder, "Don't wait up, Sharon and I might grab dinner after my shift." That was the last time her mother heard her voice. 10:15 a.m., at Miller's Diner. The diner sat off Highway 98, a squat brick building with chrome-trimmed windows and a buzzing neon sign that read, "Miller's, Best Pie in Durham." Caroline had worked there for almost a year, her friendly face making her a favorite among regulars. That morning, she served coffee to a table of construction workers, refilled sugar canisters, and laughed with Judy Miller, the owner's wife, behind the counter. Judy remembers it clearly. She was glowing that day, Judy says. Talking about nursing school, how she'd almost saved up enough for her first semester. She even joked that once she became a nurse, she'd never set foot in that greasy kitchen again. But Judy also remembers someone else. A man sitting alone in the corner booth. He ordered coffee. Didn't touch it. Just watched her, Judy says. Back then, I figured he was shy. Now? I can't stop thinking about it. 12:47 p.m., the blue Ford. After her shift, Caroline stepped outside, waving goodbye to Judy and tucking her tips into her purse. It was a blistering afternoon, the asphalt shimmering like glass. Across the street, parked beneath the shadow of a pecan tree, sat a beat-up blue Ford pickup. Several co-workers later recalled seeing it. No one thought much of it at the time. It wasn't unusual for cars to idle outside the diner in summer heat. But one detail stuck with Earl Jackson, a dishwasher who smoked his breaks out back. I swear, Earl says now, I saw that same truck sitting there 3 times that week. Same dent in the bumper. Same busted headlight. Ain't nobody ever got out. 1:15 p.m., plans with Sharon. Caroline stopped by Sharon Price's house on Maple Grove Road, just 5 minutes from the diner. The two friends sat on Sharon's porch, sipping sweet tea, talking about their upcoming trip to Myrtle Beach. Sharon remembers Caroline teasing her about packing too many swimsuits. She said, "Sharon, it's just 2 days, you don't need 6 bikinis." Caroline mentioned seeing a strange car parked near the diner again, but she brushed it off. She laughed when she said it, Sharon recalls. Said maybe she had a secret admirer. I told her she ought to be careful walking out so late, but Caroline, she never scared easy. 4:02 p.m., a stop at the gas station. On her way home, Caroline stopped at Frank's service station to top off her gas tank. The attendant, Frank Dalton, later gave a statement. She was her usual self, polite, smiling, chatty. But I do remember something. She kept looking over her shoulder, like she felt someone watching her. Surveillance cameras weren't common back then, but Frank remembers seeing that same blue Ford pull into the lot behind her, then pull out again without stopping. 6:18 p.m., last call home. Around 6, Caroline phoned home from a payphone outside the diner to let her mom know she'd be home late. Margaret Harris, her mother, answered. She said she might go out to the river after dinner, Margaret recalls. I told her to be safe. She just laughed and said, always. Investigators later traced the call to Highway 98, near a small strip mall where Caroline planned to meet Sharon. But Sharon never saw her. 7:05 p.m., witnesses on the road. Two teenage boys riding bikes near Falling Creek Trail reported seeing Caroline's rust-red Chevy Nova parked near the woods around this time. They also reported something else, a man standing just inside the tree line, smoking a cigarette. One of the boys, now in his late 50s, remembers it vividly. He was lean, wearing a ball cap, just standing there, watching her car. Police never identified the man. 8:03 p.m., the final sighting. The last confirmed sighting of Caroline came from Mrs. Edith Palmer, a retired schoolteacher who lived along the winding road that led to the river. "I saw her car pass by," Edith recalls. "She waved, I waved back. She looked happy." Mrs. Palmer also noticed something unsettling. Just a minute later, that blue Ford pickup sped past her house in the same direction. After 8:15 p.m., silence. No one knows exactly what happened next. Detectives believe Caroline parked near the river, like she always did on Fridays, to watch the sunset. At some point after 8:15 p.m., she encountered someone she knew, or thought she knew. There were no signs of a struggle at her car, no broken glass, no discarded belongings. Her keys were found neatly placed on the dashboard when her car was later discovered. Whatever happened, it happened fast. The weight of unanswered questions. 4 years, this timeline remained incomplete, riddled with what ifs. Was the man in the diner connected to the blue Ford? Did Caroline know her killer? Why did she leave her keys behind if she felt unsafe? Every witness account, every memory was a fragment, and for decades, those fragments never came together. That night, when Caroline didn't come home, Margaret Harris assumed she was still with Sharon. By midnight, worry gnawed at her. By 2 a.m., she called every friend she could think of. By sunrise, Margaret was pacing the living room, hands shaking, heart pounding. By the next morning, the search had begun. And just after 6:30 a.m., a jogger on Falling Creek Trail stumbled across something that would change Durham County forever. The morning of August 15, 1979, began like any other in the small, sleepy town of Raleigh, North Carolina. The sun had barely begun to rise over the cornfields, casting long, pale streaks of orange across the horizon. A thin mist clung stubbornly to the ground, and the air carried that heavy, wet stillness that comes right before the heat of the day settles in. For George Miller, a 62-year-old retired steelworker, mornings were ritualistic. Every day at 6:30 a.m., without fail, he'd walk his beagle, Daisy, along Old Mill Road, a quiet stretch of cracked asphalt flanked by woods on one side and an abandoned grain mill on the other. It was the kind of place most people avoided after dark, quiet, isolated, and more than a little eerie. But that morning, George noticed something different. Daisy, usually a stubborn sniffer of ditches and weeds, stopped abruptly near the bend of the road where the asphalt broke into gravel. Her ears perked, nose twitching. Then, without warning, she bolted into the underbrush, barking sharply. "Daisy, heel." George barked, yanking on the leash. The leash went taut, but the little dog wouldn't budge. Instead, she growled low, pulling toward a thick patch of brush where the earth dipped into a shallow creek bed. That's when George caught it, a smell. It wasn't the earthy rot of wet leaves or the usual dead animal stench you sometimes found out there. This was different. Acrid. Sweet. Wrong. He tightened his grip on Daisy's leash and crouched, pushing aside the branches. And there it was. At first, his brain refused to process it, the pale curve of something that looked almost like driftwood caught in the reeds. But as the mist shifted and sunlight sliced through the trees, he saw the truth. A hand. George stumbled backward, his breath caught in his throat. His heart pounded so hard it felt like his chest might split open. For a moment, the world tilted, and all he could hear was Daisy whining softly. "Dear God," he whispered. He scrambled back to the roadside, nearly tripping over his own boots, and fumbled for the payphone at the old grain mill across the street. His fingers shook as he dialed 911. 7:12 a.m., Millfield Police Dispatch. "Millfield Police. What's your emergency?" George's voice cracked. "Why you need to send someone out to Old Mill Road? Past the grain mill. I think I found a body." By 7:40 a.m., the first patrol car arrived, red and blue lights cutting through the fog. Officer Linda Hartman, a rookie only 6 months on the job, was first on scene. She'd handled traffic stops, domestic calls, even a bar fight once, but nothing like this. George led her back toward the creek bed, his breathing ragged. Linda pushed through the underbrush cautiously, her hand instinctively hovering near her holstered sidearm. When she saw it, she froze. A young woman lay half submerged in the shallow creek, tangled in reeds and brush. Her long chestnut hair, now matted with dirt and leaves, fanned out around her head. Her skin was pale, waxy, the unnatural stillness of someone long past saving. She wore a faded denim skirt and a cream-colored blouse, soaked and stained. One shoe was missing. Linda swallowed hard and forced herself to look away, fumbling for her radio. "This is Unit 3. I need detectives and crime scene out here now. Possible homicide." 8:05 a.m., the scene comes alive. Within 30 minutes, Old Mill Road transformed from a sleepy back road to a hive of flashing lights and controlled chaos. Yellow crime scene tape went up. Curious onlookers gathered at the perimeter, whispering and craning their necks. Reporters from the local paper, the Millfield Gazette, arrived before half the detectives did. Detective Frank Delaney, a 17-year veteran of the Millfield PD, crouched at the edge of the creek, his jaw tight. Beside him, CSI techs unpacked cameras, fingerprint kits, and evidence markers. Delaney lit a cigarette with shaky hands, though he'd never admit it, and exhaled slowly as he studied the body. Female. Early 20s, maybe, he muttered to himself. No obvious signs of struggle nearby. Body dumped, not killed here. The techs began snapping photos. Click, click, click. Each flash lit up the young woman's still form, capturing every detail. Nearby, Officer Hartman worked crowd control, keeping gawkers back behind the tape. Parents shielded their kids' eyes as whispers rippled through the growing crowd. 8:30 a.m., ID confirmation. They found her purse about 15 feet upstream, tangled in branches. Inside was a waterlogged driver's license. Harriet Debbie Simmons. Age, 23. Address, 114 Maple Drive. Delaney's stomach turned. Harriet Simmons. He knew that name. Everyone in Millfield did. Harriet was the sweet, smiling girl from the gas station off Main Street, the one who always knew your order before you spoke it. Her disappearance 3 nights ago had rattled the town. Flyers were still taped up on telephone poles and pinned on bulletin boards. Missing, Harriet Simmons, 23. Last seen August 12th, leaving the Rusty Nail Bar around 11:45 p.m. Until that moment, there'd still been hope. Now, that hope was gone. 9:15 a.m., forensics take over. CSI lead Carla Jennings moved with quiet precision, directing her team like a conductor. Evidence markers dotted the ground. Marker 1, a torn piece of denim caught on a branch. Marker 2, drag marks near the creek's edge. Marker 3, a single muddy boot print, size 11, leading away from the scene. Carla crouched near Harriet's body, carefully examining her hands. Her fingernails were broken and packed with dirt, clear signs she'd fought back. She turned to Delaney. She struggled. Hard. Delaney nodded grimly, staring at the drag marks that led from the roadside. Whoever did this didn't carry her far. He wanted to get rid of her fast. That meant panic. Panic meant mistakes. And mistakes meant evidence. 10:45 a.m., the coroner arrives. Coroner Dr. Samuel Price, a stoic man with a face like weathered stone, finally arrived. He knelt beside Debbie, lifting her wrist gently, his expression unreadable. Estimated time of death. 48 to 72 hours ago, he said quietly. Likely the night she vanished. Delaney lit another cigarette, staring into the creek as if it held answers. Cause? Dr. Price hesitated. Too early to say. But there are bruises on her neck. Could be strangulation. 11:30 a.m., tension mounts. By midday, the summer heat had burned away the mist, leaving the smell of decomposition hanging heavy in the air. Flies buzzed relentlessly. Reporters were shouting questions over the police line. Detective, is it Harriet Simmons? Is there a suspect? Was she assaulted? Delaney ignored them, jaw clenched. What he couldn't ignore, though, were the looks on the faces of Harriet's parents when they arrived. Margaret and Tom Simmons stumbled under the tape, ignoring officers shouting at them to stop. Margaret screamed when she saw the sheet covering Harriet's body, collapsing against her husband's chest. Tom, white-knuckled and trembling, just stared at Delaney with hollow, furious eyes. You said you'd find her, Tom rasped. You said she'd come home. Delaney opened his mouth but couldn't find words. There was nothing he could say to make it right. 12:15 p.m., the first clues. As the body was loaded into the coroner's van, Carla Jennings returned with a small evidence bag. Inside was a crumpled matchbook from the Rusty Nail Bar, the last place Harriet was seen alive. Found it near the drag marks, Carla said. Fresh. No water damage. It was dropped, not washed downstream. Delaney took the bag, turning it over in his hands. Inside, someone had scrawled a phone number in smudged ink. He looked up at Carla, his expression dark. Get this to the lab. Now. By 1 p.m., Old Mill Road was quiet again, the crowds gone, the tape fluttering lazily in the breeze. But the weight of what was found there would never leave. Harriet Simmons's body had been recovered. And somewhere in Raleigh her killer was still out there, watching, waiting, maybe even blending in with the crowd of gawkers earlier that morning. Detective Delaney made a silent vow as he stubbed out his last cigarette. I'll find you. Whoever you are, wherever you're hiding, I'll find you. The hunt had begun. Raleigh, North Carolina, September 1980. The police station smelled faintly of stale coffee and cigarette smoke. Detective Raymond Keller, a 38-year-old investigator with thinning hair and a permanent crease between his brows, sat hunched over a stack of manila folders. Outside his office window, the late summer sun was setting, painting the sky in streaks of burnt orange, but Keller wasn't looking. Harriet Simmons's disappearance had turned this quiet town inside out. 23 years old, Keller muttered, flipping through a photograph of Harriet, a smiling young woman in bell-bottoms, a denim jacket, and windblown hair. Just gone. The timeline was shaky. Harriet was last seen leaving the Willow Creek Tavern around 11:45 p.m. on September 3, 1980. From there, the trail dissolved into conflicting reports, late-night whispers, and foggy memories. The first interviews. By September 5, police had conducted nearly 24 interviews. Inside the tavern's wood-paneled walls, Keller sat across from Marion Collins, the bartender on duty that night. Harriet came in with a couple of friends, Marion recalled, wiping her palms nervously on her apron. They had maybe 2 drinks each, nothing crazy. She was laughing, dancing a little. Around quarter to midnight, she left. That's all I know. Did anyone leave with her? Keller pressed. Marion hesitated, biting her lip. I think I saw her talking to a guy by the jukebox before she left. Tall, dark hair, leather jacket. But I don't know if they left together. That description, tall, dark hair, leather jacket, would soon become the centerpiece of a tangled web of rumors. Conflicting eyewitness accounts. 2 other patrons claimed they saw Harriet leave alone, clutching her purse, heading toward the gravel parking lot. Another insisted she was laughing and walking with a man toward a blue Chevy Nova parked under a flickering streetlight. Yet another swore she saw Harriet sitting in the passenger seat of a red pickup truck around the same time. Keller's notepad filled with contradictory sketches of possibilities. Blue Chevy. Red pickup. Alone. With a man. Drunk. Sober. Smiling. Upset. Every lead branched into another dead end. Rumors take root. Within a week, Millfield was buzzing. Theories sprouted like weeds. Some whispered that Harriet had been seeing a married man in secret and that his jealous wife might have found out. Others claimed she'd been spotted arguing with a stranger outside the diner a few days earlier. By mid-September, the local paper, the Millfield Gazette, ran its first headline. Young woman missing, foul play suspected. The article fanned the flames. Parents told their daughters not to go out at night. Doors were locked earlier. Strangers became suspects in everyone's mind. Suspect number 1, the boyfriend. The first person Keller looked at was Mark Hanley, Harriet's son-again, off-again boyfriend. Mark was a 25-year-old auto mechanic, soft-spoken but quick-tempered. In the small interrogation room, Keller leaned forward, studying him. Where were you the night of September 3rd? At home, Mark said, rubbing his jaw. I watched the Reds game. Fell asleep on the couch. Alone? Yeah, Mark replied. His alibi was paper-thin. But Mark's co-workers confirmed he'd shown up for his shift the next morning, grimy and exhausted but without any signs of panic or injury. When Keller asked him about their relationship, Mark looked away. We fought a lot, he admitted quietly. She said I wasn't serious enough, that she wanted more. But I didn't hurt her. I'd never. Keller wasn't convinced, but with no evidence, Mark was released. Suspect number 2, the drifter. A week later, police received a tip about a transient man seen near the tavern that night, a hitchhiker passing through town. Locals described him as scruffy, late 30s, and real strange. Keller tracked him to an abandoned gas station on the outskirts of town, where he was sleeping in the back of his beat-up station wagon. Under questioning, the man, who went by L. Dusty Whitman, admitted he'd been at the bar but denied knowing Debbie. She wasn't my type, he sneered, which set Keller's teeth on edge. Dusty's fingerprints were taken, compared against prints lifted from Harriet's abandoned car, and no match. Another lead gone cold. The forensic war. 1980 wasn't kind to investigators when it came to technology. Harriet Chevy Vega was found abandoned 2 miles from the tavern, just off an old logging road. The driver's side door was unlocked. Her purse was missing. Forensics took days to process the vehicle, but without today's DNA tools, the results were frustratingly limited. A partial shoe print near the driver's door couldn't be matched. A single cigarette butt found in the ashtray revealed no usable saliva sample. Fibers from the car carpet were analyzed, but without a suspect's clothing to compare them to, they meant nothing. We're working in the dark, Keller grumbled during a late-night strategy meeting. If this were 20 years from now, we'd have her killer nailed already. Suspect number 3, the leather jacket man. By early October, the investigation circled back to the mysterious man Marion swore she saw Harriet talking to by the jukebox. A composite sketch was drawn based on her description: a man in his late 20s, sharp jawline, dark wavy hair, and that damned black leather jacket. Flyers went up around town, but nobody came forward. Some locals whispered that the sketch looked eerily similar to Tommy Blake, a part-time bouncer at another bar 3 towns over. When Keller interviewed him, Tommy seemed calm, cooperative, even helpful. "Yeah, I've seen her around," Tommy admitted. "Cute girl. But I wasn't at Willow Creek that night. I was working my shift at Rusty's Roadhouse till 2. Tommy's timecard backed him up. Another dead end. Pressure mounts. By late October 1980, 7 weeks had passed since Harriet vanished, and public pressure on the Millfield Police Department was reaching a boiling point. At a tense town hall meeting, Keller stood at the front of a crowded gymnasium, facing angry residents and reporters. "You've had nearly 2 months, a woman shouted from the back. "What are you even doing?" another man yelled. "My daughter won't leave the house anymore." Keller cleared his throat, gripping the microphone. "We are following every lead. But we need the community's help. If anyone knows anything at all, come forward." No one did. Whispers of something bigger. By November, theories took on a darker tone. Some believed Harriet had been abducted by someone passing through, a random act of violence by a stranger who'd already vanished down the highway. Others were convinced this was someone local, someone who knew the back roads, the shortcuts, the hidden trails where a body could vanish without a trace. And then there were the rumors about a ring of men who preyed on women in the area, trading whispered stories at bars and parties. Keller had nothing concrete, but the more he dug, the more unsettling patterns began to emerge. The case goes cold. By the end of 1980, winter settled over Millfield. Snow covered the roadside ditches, the logging trails, and the banks of Willow Creek where Keller's men had searched tirelessly. No new leads. No new suspects. Harriet's family stopped holding daily vigils and instead lit a single candle in their front window every night. For Keller, the case became an obsession, a wound that never closed. In his office, he kept Harriet's photo pinned above his desk, her green eyes staring back at him as if asking, "Why haven't you found me yet?" But answers would come, decades later, in a way no one could have imagined. Raleigh, North Carolina, winter 1982. Snow had settled like a heavy blanket over Raleigh, muffling the sounds of life. The once buzzing little town where Harriet Debbie Simmons grew up now felt haunted. 2 years had passed since she vanished, and yet her presence lingered everywhere, in whispers at the diner, in the faded missing posters still clinging stubbornly to telephone poles, and in the hollow look behind her mother's eyes. Detective Frank Doyle leaned against his patrol car, his breath forming clouds in the cold air as he watched the last of his team pack up boxes from the evidence locker. Another dead end. Another winter. Inside the station, the case files were stacked like tombstones, dozens of interviews, grainy Polaroids, sketches, and handwritten notes that now felt more like a cruel monument to failure. Frank rubbed his tired eyes. He joined the force in 1975, back when Millfield's biggest problem was teenagers drag racing down Main Street. Now, his career was defined by a single haunting question. Where was Harriet Simmons? The dead ends. The investigation had churned through suspects like a storm. First, there was Tommy Hawk Hawkins, Harriet's son-again, off-again boyfriend. He was wild, reckless, and perpetually broke, the kind of guy who carried trouble in his back pocket. Eyewitnesses swore they'd seen them arguing at Miller's gas station the night she disappeared, Tommy slamming his hand against the hood of her car. But his alibi, a late-night poker game at the VFW, checked out. Every man at the table vouched for him, and none of them wavered under questioning. Then came L. Jennings, the local mechanic who'd been spotted near the wooded area where Harriet's car was found abandoned. He had a history of public drunkenness and a reputation for inappropriate comments around young women. But Earl cracked under interrogation too easily, confessing to things he couldn't possibly have done, until the detectives realized he was just chasing attention. There was Ray Mitchell, a drifter passing through town that week, picked up for trespassing. 4 weeks, half the town was convinced Ray was the killer. He fit the boogeyman narrative perfectly. But he had no connection to Debbie, no vehicle, and a bus ticket proving he left town before she vanished. One by one, the leads dried up. One by one, the names were crossed off. Families torn apart. For Harriet's parents, every knock at the door was both hope and terror. Evelyn Simmons, Harriet's mother, would sit by the kitchen window every evening, staring at the winding road leading to their farmhouse. Her teacup would grow cold in her hands as she whispered the same words over and over, like a prayer she didn't quite believe anymore. Maybe today. Maybe they'll find her today. Her husband, Charles, handled his grief differently. He buried himself in chores, fixing fences that didn't need fixing, repainting walls that weren't chipped. Anything to stay busy. Anything to avoid the silence. In 1985, Evelyn suffered a stroke. She spent her final months bedridden, her once bright eyes dulled by heartache. On her last day, she held a photograph of Harriet in her hands and murmured, "Just find her." Charles followed 3 years later, a quiet heart attack on a Tuesday morning. The obituary barely mentioned Debbie, but everyone in town knew the search had broken him. Friends who never stopped wondering. For Harriet's younger sister, Lynn, moving on was impossible. By the early 90s, Lynn had a family of her own, but she still drove past the old diner where Harriet used to work, half expecting to see her behind the counter, laughing with a tray of coffee mugs in her hand. She organized vigils every year on Harriet's birthday, candles flickering in the North Carolina wind. Attendance dwindled with each passing year until only a handful of old classmates showed up, the kind of people who couldn't bear to let go, even when everyone else had. "I still dream about her," Lynn admitted once to a local reporter. "She's always just out of reach, like she's calling for me, but I can't get to her. It's like she's stuck somewhere." The detectives move on. By the late 1990s, most of the original investigative team had retired or transferred out. Detective Doyle, the man who had lived and breathed the case, packed his personal belongings into a cardboard box on his final day. He lingered for a moment over Harriet's file, tracing her smiling face in one of the Polaroids with his thumb. He thought about keeping a copy, but didn't. He walked out of Millfield PD knowing he'd failed her, and her family. The case shifted from active to cold. It was no longer part of weekly briefings, no longer discussed at lunch counters. The box containing the Simmons file was moved into the evidence archive, buried under decades of dust. Rumors that never died. Despite the silence in the police station, Millfield Street still whispered Harriet's name. Some swore she ran away with a secret boyfriend. Others insisted she'd been killed by someone powerful in town, someone the police didn't dare touch. In 1994, a farmer claimed he'd seen a figure matching Harriet's description on the edge of his property late one night. Search dogs combed the area but found nothing. In 1999, a psychic approached Lynn, swearing Harriet's body was near water. Another wild goose chase. Each rumor reopened old wounds. Each false lead drained a little more hope. The clue everyone overlooked. Through all the noise, one piece of evidence sat quietly in a sealed envelope deep inside the evidence locker, a DNA sample taken from a hair found tangled in the driver's side door handle of Harriet's abandoned car. In 1980, DNA analysis was science fiction. The lab report merely noted that the hair didn't belong to Debbie. It wasn't Tommy's. It wasn't Earl's. Beyond that, it meant nothing. The envelope was labeled, catalogued, and forgotten. For decades, it waited in silence as technology caught up to tragedy. The toll on a town. By the early 2000s, Millfield had changed. The factory closed, young families moved away, and Main Street lost its glow. But one thing remained the same: Harriet's disappearance was the town's open wound. At church potlucks, older residents still swapped theories in hushed tones. At high school reunions, someone always raised a glass to Harriet, wherever she is. Lynn stopped attending those gatherings. "It hurts too much," she explained once, her voice breaking. Waiting for justice. On a rainy afternoon in 2010, a new evidence technician at Millfield PD reorganized the old archives. He pulled Harriet's file out of a dusty box, his eyes scanning the sealed envelope marked item #47B. Inside was the hair, still perfectly preserved after 30 years. He had no way of knowing it yet, but this forgotten fragment of evidence would one day change everything. For now, it sat in the darkness, holding secrets only science could unlock. The woods where Harriet Debbie Simmons was found became more than just a crime scene. They became a place of whispered warnings, half-truths, and campfire tales that grew darker with every passing year. By the late 1980s, a decade after her death, Millfield's younger residents knew the story of the girl in the woods, even if they couldn't remember her name. Parents warned their children not to wander near Cedar Hollow Trail after sunset. Teachers avoided discussing it in classrooms, but everyone knew. There were parts of Millfield you simply didn't go after dark, not because you feared getting lost, but because you feared what you might find. The dare. Summer nights became a breeding ground for teenage bravado. By the early 90s, kids from Millfield High would gather at the edge of Cedar Hollow, their flashlights trembling in their hands. Someone would inevitably mutter, "If you stand by the old oak and call her name 3 times, you'll hear her scream." It started as a joke. Always did. But there was something about the way the wind whispered through the branches that made even the most skeptical kids lower their voices when they approached the clearing where Harriet's body had been found. Local law claimed that if you placed a hand on the rough bark of the oak where the first evidence flag had been staked, you could feel the cold from that September night in 1979 seeping into your bones. Some said the tree remembered what happened. Others swore they'd seen her, a flicker of a girl in bell-bottom jeans and a paisley blouse, her hair matted, her expression frozen in terror. It wasn't true, of course. But the mind plays tricks when you know you're standing where someone's last breath was stolen. From gossip to ghost story. With each passing year, the truth of Harriet's murder blurred into half-forgotten details and second-hand whispers. Some locals swore she was dating a married man, an affair gone wrong. Others insisted it was a drifter, someone passing through town who left chaos behind. A few went further, whispering that it had to be someone close to her, maybe even someone she trusted. The case file had long since grown cold, but the speculation never stopped. What began as grief morphed into something else. The murder became a backdrop for the town's identity, a shadow Millfield couldn't shake. There was even an urban legend club at the high school in the late 90s, where kids traded wild theories about unsolved cases. Harriet's name always came up. And every time, the details shifted depending on who was telling the story. Her boyfriend confessed but got off on a technicality. The cops know who did it but covered it up. It was a ritual killing. That's why they never solved it. There were no facts anymore, just fragments. And in those fragments, Millfield kept its wound open, nursing a fear that never truly healed. The occult theory. The most chilling rumors surfaced in the early 2000s when a series of strange events breathed new life into the case. In 2003, a group of amateur ghost hunters claimed to have recorded EVPs, electronic voice phenomena, near Cedar Hollow. They swore you could hear a woman whisper, "Please, stop." The recording was grainy and full of static, but it went viral in town almost overnight. Suddenly, Harriet's story wasn't just a tragedy, it was a haunting. That same year, local teenagers began spray painting crude symbols on the trees near the trail. Pentagrams. Cryptic markings. A few of them swore that Harriet's death had been the result of some occult ritual, that she'd been chosen as a sacrifice. No one ever proved it, but the idea stuck. Even now, if you ask around, some Millfield residents will lower their voices and say, they never solved it, because they didn't want to. An overlooked clue. What the rumors never touched, what no one outside law enforcement even knew, was that a small biological sample had been collected at the scene in 1979 and locked away. Back then, DNA analysis didn't exist. The evidence sat in a sealed envelope for decades, unremarkable and forgotten, a relic of a case too cold for anyone to care about. Every wild theory, every whispered ghost story, every dare beneath the old oak tree, none of it mattered compared to the quiet fact that the truth had been sitting in an evidence locker the entire time, waiting for science to catch up. The kids who scared each other on summer nights didn't know. The parents who warned their children didn't know. Even the detectives who'd worked the case and retired with regret didn't know. The answers weren't gone. They were waiting. The weight of silence. By the mid-2010s, Harriet's story had become background noise, a piece of local history folded into small-town identity. Her parents had passed, her siblings moved away, and most of the original detectives were dead or retired. But for some, the case still lingered like an unfinished sentence. There was Mrs. Kowalski, the elderly woman who'd lived 2 houses down from the Simmons family and still left a candle burning in her window every September. There was Tommy Bryant, who'd been Harriet's classmate, now a father himself, who refused to let his daughters walk alone anywhere near Cedar Hollow. And there was the trail itself, unchanging, quiet, patient. Nature had reclaimed the clearing, erasing any visible signs of what happened. But for those who knew the story, every snapping twig felt like an echo of footsteps, every gust of wind carried the weight of a scream. Setting the stage for discovery. 40 years of whispers. 40 years of fear. 40 years of a name that became less a person and more a warning. No one in Millfield knew that the tide was about to turn. Because in a quiet corner of the state crime lab, that sealed envelope still sat, marked evidence, do not destroy. And the world had finally caught up to the secrets it contained. The next knock on a door, the next ring of a phone, the next test run in a sterile lab would change everything. But for now, all Millfield had were its legends. And in the shadows of Cedar Hollow, the truth waited patiently to be found. March 2022, the breakthrough no one saw coming. The Millfield Police Department's cold case unit was a small, dusty office tucked away on the third floor of the county courthouse. The blinds were half broken, sunlight leaking through in uneven stripes across stacks of old boxes marked with fading labels. Simmons, Harriet, 1979. Do not destroy. For more than 43 years, these files had sat untouched, only revisited when fresh eyes dared to dig through the past. Most detectives had come and gone, retiring without answers. But on this quiet March morning in 2022, Detective Ellen Granger sat at her desk, cradling a mug of lukewarm coffee, staring at the faded photos of a smiling young woman with feathered brown hair. Harriet Debbie Simmons. 23 years old. Vanished. Body found 3 days later. No suspects. No closure. Ellen had been a child when Harriet went missing. Now, at 47, she was the one tasked with solving the mystery that had haunted Millfield for generations. And on this day, she decided to try something the department had never dared before. The submission. Ellen slid on a pair of powder blue latex gloves, carefully opening the sealed evidence bag. Inside, wrapped in aged wax paper, was a single fragment of fabric, the torn hem of Harriet's blouse. Dried, dark stains marked the edges. For decades, the department had stored this scrap, hoping technology would one day catch up. That day had finally come. This is it, Ellen whispered to herself, gently extracting a tiny swab of material. The lab techs had confirmed there was still viable DNA. She uploaded the newly sequenced profile into GEDmatch, one of the largest genetic genealogy databases in the country, the same kind used to unmask the Golden State Killer just a few years earlier. It wasn't an instant process. It never was. These things took time. She clicked submit and sat back, exhaling slowly. Let's see who you really were, she murmured, as if speaking to Harriet herself. The waiting. 3 weeks passed. The system churned quietly in the background, cross-referencing millions of DNA profiles. Every day Ellen refreshed her email with a strange mix of hope and dread. Don't get your hopes up, her colleague Detective Marco Ruiz warned. We've been burned before. But Ellen couldn't help it. This case had consumed her. Harriet wasn't just another file. She represented every unsolved story in this town. And then, one rainy Thursday afternoon in late April 2022, an email notification pinged on her computer. The hit. Subject, partial familial match, Harriet Simmons case. Ellen froze. For a moment, she couldn't even click it. Her hands trembled. When she finally opened the file, her breath caught. The match wasn't to a suspect. Not directly. It was to someone living hundreds of miles away, a 26-year-old woman in North Carolina who had uploaded her DNA to trace her family history. 3.2% shared DNA. Estimated relation, second cousin. It wasn't much. On paper, it was a dead end. But Ellen had learned long ago that in cold cases, even a thread could unravel the whole sweater. The digging begins. Over the next few days, Ellen and Marco built out a massive family tree based on the match, combing through census records, obituaries, property deeds, marriage licenses, anything they could find. Slowly, names and faces from the 1940s, 50s, and 60s populated their whiteboard. Generations of Millfield families emerged like ghosts from the past. Then, one branch of the tree caught Ellen's eye. A man in his 20s during the late 1970s. He would have been around Millfield. He matched the right age, the right location, and had the right access to the area where Harriet's body was found. Ellen circled his name in red marker. Thomas Tommy Reed. The first twist. Tommy Reed had died in 1997. Car accident. No mugshots, no record of violence. Just a tragic obituary tucked in the local paper. Damn, Marco muttered, slamming his pen on the desk. That's it then. Another dead end. Ellen shook her head. No. If Tommy's our link, then someone close to him might still be out there. Someone with the same DNA. She ordered a deeper dive into the Reed family. Property records revealed something odd. Tommy's younger brother, Harold Reed, still lived in Millfield, less than 2 miles from the original crime scene. And Harold? He had a sealed juvenile record from 1978. Ellen's got twisted. The breakthrough. With a court order, Ellen got access to Harold's old file. Inside were police reports about a peeping incident near Harriet's apartment complex just 4 months before she vanished. The officers back then had written him off as a troubled kid. He was 17, Marco whispered, scanning the file. They never connected him. No one had DNA back then, Ellen said. And the Reed family, they were Millfield royalty. No one wanted to stir the pot. Ellen stared at Harold's photo from 1978. Shaggy hair. Cold, dark eyes. I think we found our guy. The second twist. They ordered Harold's DNA sample from a 1984 DUI arrest still sitting in the state database. When the lab called 3 weeks later, Ellen answered on the first ring. Detective Granger? You'd better sit down. She did. It's not Harold. Ellen blinked. What? The DNA doesn't match. Not even close. Her stomach dropped. If not Harold, then who? The unexpected link. Ellen went back to the Reed family tree and started from scratch. Every marriage, every child, every cousin. And then she saw it, a hidden branch. Tommy and Harold's mother had a half-brother. He didn't carry the Reed surname, which is why Ellen missed him at first. His name was Frank Dwyer. Frank had lived right next door to Harriet Simmons in 1979. Marco leaned back in his chair, whispering, "Oh my God, it's been under our noses the whole time." The shockingly close connection. Frank Dwyer wasn't just a neighbor. He'd been Harriet's landlord. At the time, he was a 29-year-old handyman with full access to her building. There had been no record of conflict, no formal complaints. He was the friendly guy everyone trusted. Frank had moved out of Millfield in 1982. Changed jobs. Changed counties. He'd faded into obscurity. Until now. A quick search revealed Frank was still alive, now 72 years old, living quietly under the radar in rural Indiana. Ellen stared at his recent driver's license photo. His face had aged, but his cold, heavy-lidded stare was unmistakable. After 43 years, she whispered, we finally have him. Setting the trap. Ellen contacted Indiana state authorities and orchestrated a surreptitious DNA collection. A discarded coffee cup from Frank's trash was enough. 2 weeks later, the lab results arrived. She opened the report with trembling hands. Match probability, 99.998%. Frank Dwyer's DNA was on Harriet Simmons's blouse. Ellen closed her eyes, exhaling a breath she didn't know she'd been holding. But there was one more problem. When Ellen prepared the arrest warrant, something unexpected surfaced. Frank Dwyer wasn't just some random landlord. He had married into one of Millfield's most powerful families in the early 1980s. His wife? The daughter of a former county sheriff who had oversaw the original investigation. It wasn't incompetence that buried the case for 43 years. It was protection. Closing beat. On July 15, 2022, Ellen and a team of deputies pulled up outside Frank Dwyer's farmhouse. As they walked up the gravel drive, the air hung thick with summer heat and tension. Frank answered the door slowly, his weathered face betraying no emotion. Ellen held up her badge. Frank Dwyer? You're under arrest for the murder of Harriet Simmons. For the first time, his mask cracked, just slightly. A twitch at the corner of his mouth. Took you long enough, he muttered. Ellen stared at him, unblinking. 43 years, she said. But we got you. March 2022, Millfield Police Department. The rain tapped steadily against the glass windows of the Millfield Police Department. Inside, the cold fluorescent lights hummed, reflecting off stacks of yellowed case files that smelled faintly of dust and forgotten time. Detective Laura Hensley sat at the center of it all, her desk crowded with old photographs, handwritten statements, and crime scene reports dating back to 1979. Harriet Simmons's face stared back at her from a faded missing person flyer. Laura leaned back, rubbing her temples. 43 years, she murmured. 43 years, and we finally have something. The catalyst had come weeks earlier, a familial DNA match from the genealogical database. The sample they'd uploaded, a scrap of genetic material from under Harriet's fingernails, had linked distantly to someone still alive. At first, it seemed like a dead end, a third cousin living in Oregon. But the deeper the team dug into the match, the more threads began to unravel. A fresh start. Detective Hensley called in Detective Mark Rivas, a seasoned investigator who'd worked cold cases for 2 decades. "We're treating this like day one," she said, motioning to the evidence board. "Everything gets revisited. Every lie, every alibi, every name." The two set out to re-interview old witnesses, people who'd lived through 1979, some of whom had built entire lives on secrets they thought were buried forever. Interview 1, the best friend who stayed silent. The first stop was Carol Jennings, Harriet childhood best friend. Carol was now in her 60s, living in a small bungalow on the edge of town. Her eyes widened when she opened the door and saw the detectives. "It's about Debbie, isn't it?" she whispered before they even spoke. Inside, the house smelled faintly of lavender and old paperbacks. Laura laid out a stack of photos on the kitchen table, snapshots of Harriet laughing in the summer sun, scribbled notes from her journal, a timeline of her last known movements. Carol stared at the images for a long time, her hands trembling slightly. "I should have said something back then," she said finally. Laura leaned forward. "Said what, Carol?" There was a long pause. Then Carol exhaled shakily. "The night she disappeared. I saw her. I saw who she was with." The detectives exchanged glances. Carol hesitated, wringing her hands. It was Michael Torrance. He was older, maybe 25. He used to hang around the Millfield diner. Harriet told me he scared her sometimes, but she didn't want to make a big deal out of it. Laura's pen scratched furiously across her notebook. Michael Torrance's name had appeared in the original case file, but only once. He'd given a statement claiming he'd been out of town the night Harriet vanished. His alibi had been accepted without question. Until now. Interview 2, the man with the broken alibi. The detectives tracked down Michael Torrance, now a 68-year-old retiree living 2 counties over. When they arrived, Torrance's hands shook slightly as he lit a cigarette on his porch. "I already told the cops everything back then," he said gruffly. Laura laid a single document on the table, an employment record uncovered by the cold case team just days before. "Funny thing, Michael. You said you were working that night. You swore it, in fact. But this here," she tapped the paper, "says you called out the night Harriet disappeared." Torrance's eyes darted to the paper and then away. His throat worked as he swallowed hard. I don't remember that," he muttered. Mark leaned forward, voice low. "Help us remember, Michael. Where were you that night?" Torrance exhaled slowly, the ash of his cigarette trembling. I was at the diner. I saw her there. But I left before she did, I swear." But his statement cracked under pressure. For the first time, they had proof that his 1979 alibi was a lie. The overlooked letter. Back at the station, Laura dug deeper into the old evidence boxes. That's when she found it, an unopened envelope, yellowed with age, tucked inside a manila folder marked miscellaneous. Inside was a letter written by Harriet to her sister, dated July 15, 1979, the day before she vanished. Her handwriting was hurried, almost frantic. "If anything happens to me, tell Mom it was about Michael. I think he's been following me. Please, don't let him get away with it." Laura's chest tightened as she read it aloud to the team. For 43 years, this letter had been sitting unnoticed in the archives. Witnesses finally crack. With the letter in hand, the detectives revisited other key witnesses from 1980, people who'd testified, lied, or stayed silent. One by one, they began to talk. A former waitress from the Millfield diner admitted she saw Michael arguing with Harriet that night. A mechanic confessed he fixed Michael's car the next morning, a car with fresh scratches along the passenger door. Even Michael's younger brother, Thomas Torrance, broke down under questioning. "Mike came home that night covered in mud. He made me burn his shirt. I didn't ask why." Every lie unraveled. Every omission exposed. The net tightens. By August 2022, the reopened investigation had transformed into a full-blown homicide inquiry. Laura pinned the final pieces on the evidence board: Harriet's letter, the falsified employment record, the genealogical DNA link, and fresh witness statements. The board was no longer a mess of disconnected fragments. It was a roadmap to Michael Torrance. Detective Rivas stood beside her, arms crossed. 43 years later, he said softly, and it's all coming back to him. Laura stared at Harriet's photo one last time before turning away. The past wasn't just whispering anymore. It was screaming. Ending beat, the knock on the door. Late one September evening, Michael Torrance sat in his recliner, the television flickering in the background. A sharp knock echoed through his quiet house. He opened the door to find Detective Hensley and two uniformed officers. "Michael Torrance," she said, her voice steady, "we need you to come with us." His face drained of color. For 43 years, Michael thought he'd buried the truth. But the truth had claws. And now, it had finally caught up. The conference room in the Millfield Police Department was quiet except for the low hum of the fluorescent lights above. A corkboard filled with decades-old photographs dominated one wall, images of Harriet Debbie Simmons, the 23-year-old whose disappearance in 1979 had haunted this small town for over 4 decades. Detective Laura Bennett stood in front of the board, arms crossed, her gaze fixed on a grainy black-and-white photo of Harriet smiling with her friends. Around her, files were stacked knee-high on the table, crime scene sketches spread across the surface. Across from her, Detective Mark Hensley shuffled through a manila folder, flipping past faded statements from witnesses long since moved away, grown old, or dead. "We've been staring at the same damn files for months," Hensley muttered, frustration lacing his voice. "But this time," Bennett said softly, almost to herself, "we've got something we never had before." Pinned at the center of the board was the DNA report, a partial familial match that had cracked the investigation wide open. The name wasn't a direct hit, but it had led them to an unexpected family tree. And at the very top of that tree sat someone they never saw coming. The breakthrough. 2 weeks earlier, Bennett had run the decades-old DNA sample, pulled from a cigarette but found near the abandoned lot where Harriet's scar was discovered, through a genetic genealogy database. At first, the result seemed like another dead end, a distant relative, someone living 3 states away, no criminal record. But when Bennett started digging deeper, cross-referencing family trees and old employment records, she found a name that kept circling back like a shadow refusing to disappear. Richard "Rick" Callahan. Back in 1979, Rick had been a local handyman in Millfield, fixing fences, painting houses, mowing lawns. A friendly face everyone knew. But when detectives pulled his employment records, one entry jumped off the page. July 14, 1979, on-site maintenance, Millfield Supply Warehouse. Same date Harriet disappeared. No one had ever connected him to the case before. 2. Revisiting the past. The next morning, Bennett and Hensley drove out to Brooklyn Avenue, where Rick Callahan still lived. His modest ranch-style house sat at the end of a cul-de-sac, its paint faded, blinds drawn tight. As they parked across the street, Bennett flipped through her notes. "Back then," she said, "he gave a statement saying he was out of town the weekend Harriet vanished." "And no one challenged it?" Hensley asked. "No one thought to," Bennett replied. "Rick was harmless. Or at least, that's what everyone thought." Before approaching him, they decided to re-interview old witnesses, people who'd been teenagers and young adults back in '79, the ones who had claimed they didn't see anything. 3. Cracks in the lies. Eleanor Ellie Marsh, now 64, had been one of Harriet's closest friends. She sat across from Bennett in her small living room, wringing her hands nervously. "Ellie," Bennett said gently, sliding an old photograph across the table, "you told the original detectives you left the bonfire around midnight. You swore Rick wasn't there." Ellie's lips trembled. Her eyes darted to the picture, where a younger, carefree version of herself smiled beside Debbie. "I lied," she whispered, tears pooling in her eyes. "Why?" Bennett pressed. "Because Rick was there," Ellie admitted, her voice shaking. "He was drunk. He was watching Harriet all night. We all knew he liked her, but she wasn't interested. When she left, he followed her. I thought it was nothing." The silence that followed was heavy. For over 40 years, Ellie had carried that secret. 4. The overlooked letter. Back at the station, Hensley dug through an evidence box no one had touched in decades. Among the yellowing papers and dust-covered folders, he found a crumpled envelope addressed to Millfield Police Department. Inside was an anonymous letter, postmarked July 20, 1979. "You should look at the handyman. He's not who he seems." Somehow, this letter had been filed and forgotten. Now, paired with the DNA lead, it was damning. 5. Watching Rick. With the evidence mounting, Bennett convinced the DA to authorize surveillance. For the next 3 weeks, unmarked cars rotated shifts outside Rick Callahan's house. They watched him mow his lawn, buy groceries, feed his dog. Outwardly, he looked like any other aging Midwesterner. But Bennett noticed something. Rick always checked his rearview mirror. He always glanced over his shoulder. And when she finally followed him one afternoon to the Millfield River, she saw him standing at the edge of the water, staring out in silence for nearly an hour. "That's not nostalgia," she muttered into her recorder. "That's guilt." 6. Closing the net. By May 2023, the case file had transformed from a cold case relic into a tight web of evidence. Genetic genealogy match linked Rick's distant relative to him. Employment records placed him at the supply warehouse the night Harriet disappeared. Witness recantations, Ellie and 2 others admitted Rick followed Harriet from the bonfire. Anonymous letter pointed directly at him in 1979. Still, Bennett knew they needed one last nail in the coffin, a direct DNA match. 7. The coffee cup. On a rainy Thursday morning, Hensley followed Rick to a diner on the outskirts of town. Rick ordered coffee, eggs, and toast, alone, as always. When he left, he tossed his empty coffee cup into the trash. Hensley retrieved it minutes later, carefully sealing it in an evidence bag. 2 weeks later, the results came back. 99.8% matched to the cigarette but found near Harriet's abandoned car. Bennett exhaled shakily when she saw the report. 44 years, she whispered. And we finally have him. 8. The calm before the storm. Before moving on Rick, Bennett wanted to confront him, without cuffs, without pressure, to see how he'd react. They arranged to casually stop by his house under the pretense of following up on old maintenance records. Rick answered the door, his thinning gray hair damp with sweat despite the cool spring air. "Detectives," he said slowly, his voice wary. "Rick," Bennett greeted, her tone warm but measured. "We're revisiting Harriet Simmons's case. You remember her, right?" For a fraction of a second, his jaw tightened. "Of course," he said flatly. "Terrible thing." Bennett studied him carefully, letting the silence stretch until it became unbearable. Finally, Rick cleared his throat and stepped back. "I don't know anything about it," he muttered. "We'll see," Bennett replied softly. 9. Final preparations. Back at the station, the team gathered around the board one last time. Every thread now pointed in one direction, Rick Callahan. "Tomorrow," Bennett said, her voice steady, "we bring him in." Hensley nodded, gripping the back of a chair. "After 44 years, he said, Harriet finally gets justice." March 14, 2023, 5:12 a.m. The early morning quiet of Raleigh, North Carolina was shattered by the low rumble of unmarked police vehicles rolling down Oakwood Lane. Inside one of them, Detective Evelyn Brooks sat rigid, her hands clenched around a worn manila folder. On its tab, the faded label read, "Simmons, Harriet, Homicide, 1979. For 44 years, the name had haunted this department. This wasn't supposed to happen today. Not after so long. But the partial DNA match they'd uncovered weeks earlier had cracked open a case everyone thought would remain frozen in time. And now, as they pulled up to a modest 2-story colonial home, they weren't just knocking on a door. They were kicking open 4 decades of buried lies. 5:17 a.m., the knock. A soft rain fell, streaking the police vehicle's windshield. Evelyn checked her watch, then gave a curt nod. "All right," said Detective Mark Hanley, her partner. "Let's do this." 2 uniformed officers flanked the door. Evelyn stepped forward and knocked firmly, her knuckles rapping like a judge's gavel. Inside, there was movement, hurried footsteps, a muffled voice. Finally, the door creaked open. Standing there was Thomas "Tom" Kincaid, 67 years old. His once dark hair was now silver, his hands rough and weathered from decades of blue-collar work. To anyone else, he looked like an ordinary grandfather. But Evelyn knew better now. "Mr. Kincaid," she said calmly, flashing her badge. "Detective Evelyn Brooks, Millfield PD. We need to speak with you." His eyes darted between the badges, the uniforms, the marked cars down the street. Confusion twisted into recognition, and then into fear. "What's this about?" he asked, his voice shaky. Evelyn didn't answer directly. "Sir, we have a warrant for your arrest in connection with the 1979 murder of Harriet Simmons." The color drained from his face. I didn't." "Step outside, Tom," Hanley interrupted, voice firm but controlled. The old man's shoulders sagged. He raised his trembling hands slowly, glancing back into the hallway as if expecting someone to save him. But there was no one. Within seconds, handcuffs clicked into place. The ride to the station. The car was silent except for the rhythmic swish of windshield wipers. Tom stared out the window, rain blurring the passing world. Evelyn watched him carefully in the rearview mirror. His breathing was shallow, rapid. Finally, he whispered, almost to himself. "I thought this was over. I thought nobody would ever find out." Hanley turned, his tone flat. Funny thing about secrets, Tom. They don't stay buried forever. Tom swallowed hard, his jaw clenching. He didn't say another word. 7:02 a.m., Interrogation Room 2. The small gray-walled room smelled faintly of coffee and cold metal. Evelyn sat across from Tom at the table, a digital recorder blinking steadily between them. Hanley leaned against the wall, arms crossed. Tom avoided their eyes, staring instead at his cuffed hands. Evelyn slid a photo across the table, a grainy black and white of Harriet Simmons, smiling, bright-eyed, alive. "You remember her, don't you?" she asked softly. Tom hesitated. His throat bobbed as he swallowed. I don't know. It was so long ago." Evelyn didn't push, not yet. She opened the manila folder, pulling out documents, one by one, letting the silence weigh heavy. A 1979 employment record placing Tom on the late shift at Hollister Steel Works, just 3 blocks from where Harriet's body was found. Witness statements from co-workers who remembered Tom leaving early that night. And finally, the DNA report. "Tom," Evelyn said, sliding the last document toward him, "your DNA was on the scarf we found with Harriet's body. That scarf was tied around her neck." Tom's breath hitched audibly. Hanley leaned forward, voice sharp. 44 years, Tom. You had a life. A family. Grandkids. But she didn't. You left her in a ditch like garbage." Tom shook his head violently, tears welling in his eyes. "I didn't mean to," he burst out. Evelyn froze. There it was, the crack. The breaking point. Tom's confession didn't come all at once. It came in fragments, torn from him like splinters. At first, he insisted it was an accident. She came to the plant that night," he said, his voice shaking. "She was looking for her boyfriend. We talked. I offered to drive her home. I just wanted to help." Evelyn exchanged a glance with Hanley but let him continue. She started asking questions about money missing from the plant. "About my supervisor. She said she was gonna tell someone." His breathing quickened. I panicked. I grabbed her scarf. I didn't think, God, I didn't think." He covered his face with his hands, sobbing now. Evelyn let the silence stretch. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady but cold. "You strangled her, Tom. Then you dumped her body and went home to your wife." Tom nodded slowly, broken. "I thought if nobody knew, it'd just go away. But it never did. Every time I drove past that road, I saw her face. Every night, I heard her choking." Hanley stepped forward, placing the signed Miranda waiver on the table. "You're confessing to the murder of Harriet Simmons?" he asked. Tom hesitated, his eyes red and swollen. Then, in barely a whisper, "Yes." Aftermath. Outside the interrogation room, Evelyn leaned against the wall, staring at the ceiling. Hanley handed her a cup of lukewarm coffee. "Hell of a morning," he muttered. She nodded, too drained to respond. Through the one-way glass, they watched Tom slump in his chair, a hollow shell of the man they dragged from his home just hours earlier. 44 years, Hanley said quietly. He thought he got away with it. Evelyn took a slow sip of coffee, her gaze fixed on Tom. "Nobody gets away with it," she said. "Not forever." Epilogue, the call. Later that afternoon, Evelyn stood outside the station, phone pressed to her ear. "Mrs. Simmons," she said softly when the elderly voice answered. There was a pause. Then, hopeful, trembling, "Yes?" "This is Detective Evelyn Brooks, Millfield PD. I wanted you to know, we made an arrest this morning." Silence. A ragged breath. Then, through tears, Mrs. Simmons whispered, "I thought I'd die before I ever heard those words." Evelyn's throat tightened. She stared out at the gray horizon, the drizzle still falling. "Justice took 44 years, she said quietly. "But we got him." Location, County Courthouse, September 2023. The air in the courthouse was thick with tension. After more than 4 decades of speculation, rumor, and sleepless nights, the case that haunted Raleigh, North Carolina, finally reached its reckoning. Rows of pew-like benches creaked under the weight of neighbors, friends, and journalists packed shoulder to shoulder, their whispers a constant undertone beneath the sterile hum of fluorescent lights. At the defense table sat Richard Rick Calloway, now 68 years old, a frail man with thinning white hair, a pale complexion, and trembling hands that betrayed his attempt at composure. He had once been a fixture in the community, a man nobody would have suspected. But now, his lined face and hollow eyes reflected the burden of a life spent hiding from the past. Across from him, at the prosecution table, sat Assistant District Attorney Laura Brenner, her sharp gaze fixed on Rick. Beside her, lead detective Mark Ellison, the man who reopened the case, quietly leafed through files, the culmination of years of persistence that had led them here. Opening statements. The prosecution wasted no time. In 1979, Harriet Simmons was a 23-year-old daughter, sister, and friend. On a warm September night, she left work and never made it home. For 44 years, her family waited for answers. And today, ladies and gentlemen, you will hear those answers. Ada Brenner's voice cracked slightly on 44 years, but she steadied herself quickly, locking eyes with the jury. She described the overlooked DNA, the genealogical breakthrough, and the letter unearthed from Rick's employment records, placing him near the scene the night Harriet vanished. The defense countered, trying to paint the DNA evidence as unreliable due to its age. This is not justice. This is desperation. After 4 decades, memories fade, evidence degrades, and the prosecution wants you to believe they've found the truth. But reasonable doubt remains. Rick stared down at his hands, never once looking at Harriet's family. Key testimonies. One by one, witnesses took the stand. First came Martha Simmons, Harriet's younger sister. Her voice trembled but didn't break as she clutched a framed photo of Debbie, her green eyes locking with the jury's. 4 years, we begged for answers. We called the police. We searched woods and rivers ourselves. We prayed for closure. And now, we just want to finally let her rest. Then came Tom Weller, Rick's former co-worker in 1979. Back then, Tom had lied, claiming Rick was at a company retreat the night Harriet disappeared. But now, after 4 decades of silence, the weight was too much. I lied for him, Tom admitted, voice shaking. Rick told me to cover for him. Said he couldn't risk losing his family. I thought it was nothing serious. God forgive me, I didn't know. The gallery gasped. The most damning testimony, however, came from Detective Ellison. He presented the DNA genealogical match, explaining how decades-old evidence linked Rick's family tree to the crime scene. He spoke with clinical precision, walking the jury through every step. How the decades-old cigarette but preserved in evidence matched a partial profile. How a third cousin uploaded their DNA to a public genealogy site in 2022. How that single clue unraveled a web of connections leading straight to Rick. Finally, he revealed the letter found in Rick's old employment records, proving he'd lied about being out of town. This wasn't chance, Ellison said, holding up the fragile piece of paper in a gloved hand. This was deception. The confession. On the 5th day of trial, the unexpected happened. Rick's defense team called him to the stand, a gamble that rarely ends well. His voice cracked as he began, hands gripping the railing so tightly his knuckles blanched. I didn't mean for it to happen, he whispered, eyes darting across the silent courtroom. Harriet and I, we'd been talking for months. She wanted to leave town. I tried to stop her that night, just to talk. But she panicked. She screamed. I didn't mean to. Gasps erupted from the gallery. Martha covered her mouth as tears streamed down her face. Rick broke down completely, sobbing into his hands as the bailiff gently steadied him. His lawyer looked defeated. The jury stared, stone-faced, absorbing every word. By the end of the day, the defense rested without calling another witness. Verdict and sentencing. 2 days later, the jury filed back in. We, the jury, find the defendant, Richard Calloway, guilty of second-degree murder. Martha wept openly, clutching her mother's hand. Detective Ellison closed his eyes, exhaling a breath he'd been holding for years. Rick sat motionless, as though the weight of 4 decades had finally crushed him. At sentencing, the judge spoke directly to Rick. You denied this family peace for 44 years. You chose silence over accountability. And now, justice demands its due. Rick was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Aftermath. Outside the courthouse, the Simmons family stood together under a gray autumn sky. Cameras flashed, microphones crowded, but Martha spoke softly, almost to herself. This doesn't bring Harriet back. But it brings her home. Detective Ellison, who had spent years digging into forgotten files and chasing faint leads, finally allowed himself a small, tired smile. The town of Raleigh, once haunted by whispers, could finally breathe again. But beneath the closure was a deeper, quieter tragedy. That justice had taken 44 years, that Harriet's life had been reduced to cold case files and dusty boxes in an evidence room. As Martha placed fresh flowers on Harriet's grave later that evening, the camera of our story lingers, on the trembling petals, the weathered stone, and the inscription etched in fading granite. Harriet Simmons, beloved daughter and sister. Gone, but never forgotten. The trial was over. The courtroom had emptied, the press had moved on, and for the first time in 43 years, the town of Raleigh, North Carolina could exhale. But justice, as everyone learned, doesn't arrive neatly packaged. It leaves behind ripples, and sometimes, wreckage. 1. The silent town. Spring sunlight bathed the streets of Raleigh, yet a heaviness lingered in the air. People still paused at the old Simmons house on Oak Ridge Lane, where Harriet Debbie Simmons grew up. The white paint was chipped, the shutters warped by decades of wind and rain, but the small memorial out front, a cross, faded flowers, handwritten notes, had grown again after the trial. 4 years, Harriet had been more of a rumor than a person. A what happened whispered over backyard fences. But now, she was finally known again, not just as a name, not just as a missing girl, but as someone whose life had mattered. Detective Harper Collins, who had shepherded the case through its final chapter, drove slowly past the house on his way out of town. He rolled down his window, letting the spring air rush in. 43 years, he muttered under his breath, shaking his head. And now it's over. Except, it wasn't over. Not really. 2. The family's closure, and its complications. Harriet's younger sister, Karen Simmons, sat on the porch swing of her ranch-style home, staring at a framed photograph of her sister from 1979. Harriet was laughing in the picture, caught mid-spin in a floral summer dress. "I thought this would fix everything," Karen admitted to a reporter weeks after the verdict. "I thought, once we knew, once we had a name, once there was a trial, I thought I'd finally be free." Her voice cracked. But knowing doesn't erase the missing. It doesn't bring her back. All it does is tell you where to point the anger. Karen had been just 16 when Harriet vanished. Her parents had died without answers. 4 decades, she'd carried the weight alone, keeping old letters, pestering detectives, showing up at community vigils when the rest of the town stopped coming. Now she found herself unsure how to move forward. Harriet Skiller, Robert Hensley, was behind bars for life, but the man had lived a normal, unremarkable existence for decades, coached Little League, ran a hardware store, smiled at neighbors. That was the hardest part for Karen. He got to live all these years. Harriet didn't. 3. The detective's reckoning. For Detective Collins, the case had been a professional victory, yes, but it was also a mirror he couldn't stop staring into. He sat in his cluttered office weeks later, flipping through old case files one last time. The yellowed pages smelled faintly of mildew, ink smudged from hands long gone. "This file sat on a shelf for 40 years, he whispered. And the answer was in here the whole damn time. It had been a single overlooked detail, an employment record showing that Hensley had been working maintenance at the Millfield Motel in 1979, just blocks from where Harriet was last seen. Investigators back then had interviewed him briefly, but his alibi, corroborated by a friend, went unchallenged. That friend, it turned out, had finally cracked under re-interview in 2022. After 4 decades of guilt, he admitted he'd lied. Hensley wasn't home that night. He never was. Collins thought about that a lot. How many other cases sat gathering dust? How many other names were forgotten? How many other families were still waiting for the phone call Karen Simmons finally got? 4. The power of science. The real turning point, everyone knew, came in March 2022 when Collins submitted Harriet's decades-old evidence to a genetic genealogy database. At first, the partial familial match looked like a dead end, a distant cousin living in Arizona, hundreds of miles away, no apparent connection to Millfield. But as genealogists built out the family tree, one branch led right back home, to Robert Hensley. In court, Collins testified. "Without the advancements in genetic genealogy, we would not be here today." The case became a quiet landmark in North Carolina, one of the earliest cold cases in the state solved primarily through consumer DNA databases. But it also reignited an ethical debate: how far should law enforcement go in tracing our genetic footprints? For Karen Simmons, though, there was no debate. If this is what it takes to give families answers, then do it. Do it every time. 5. The town grapples with its past. Millfield had been carrying an invisible wound for decades, and Hensley's arrest forced everyone to re-examine old memories. People who'd grown up with him recalled the easy smile, the hardware store discounts, the way he never raised his voice. But others admitted there had always been something unsettling, a coldness behind the charm. Old witnesses who lied back in 1980 came forward publicly now, some apologizing at community meetings, others avoiding eye contact altogether. "I was scared," one man confessed, voice shaking. Back then, you didn't question people like him. He was respected. The trial forced Millfield to confront not just the crime but its complicity, the way small-town loyalty and silence had delayed justice for decades. 6. A voice for the voiceless. In the months after the sentencing, an investigative journalist named Vanessa Carter published a long-form expose on Harriet's case. It wasn't just about Hensley, it was about every Harriet out there, every cold case buried under the weight of time and indifference. The piece went viral, sparking renewed interest in using genetic genealogy to tackle unsolved murders nationwide. Vanessa wrote, "Justice delayed doesn't have to be justice denied. Every profile sitting in an evidence locker carries a name. Every nameless file represents a family waiting by the phone. Harriet Simmons waited 43 years for someone to fight for her. How many more are we willing to leave behind?" 7. The bigger picture. By late 2023, the ripple effect of Harriet's case was undeniable. 3 other North Carolina cold cases were reopened using the same DNA techniques. State funding for cold case investigations doubled. A bill requiring unsolved homicide evidence to be preserved indefinitely gained momentum in the legislature. For Detective Collins, that was the real legacy. Not Hensley's imprisonment, but the fact that Harriet's story would change the outcome for families he hadn't even met yet. "This case," he said at a conference, "reminds us why we can't stop looking. No matter how much time passes, someone is still waiting for the truth." 8. Epilogue, a name remembered. On a quiet Sunday in September, a small crowd gathered at the edge of Millfield Park for the dedication of a new memorial. A plaque bore Harriet's name, alongside a simple inscription. She was loved. She was missed. She is remembered. Karen stood at the podium, hands trembling slightly as she spoke. "For 43 years, my sister was a question mark. Today, she gets to be a period. Her story has an ending now. But this isn't just for her. It's for every family still waiting. Don't give up. Please, don't give up." The wind rustled through the trees as the crowd bowed their heads. Somewhere nearby, a child laughed, life going on, even as the past finally settled into place. Harriet Simmons disappeared on a warm July night in 1979. For decades, she was a whisper, a photograph fading in a family album, a case file buried in dust. In 2023, science caught up with the truth. But the bigger story isn't just about one life lost, it's about every name we don't know yet, every story waiting in silence. Because in the end, justice isn't about the passage of time. It's about persistence. It's about remembering. The gavel's echo was still ringing in the courthouse as people shuffled out of the gallery. For the Simmons family, justice had finally arrived after more than 4 decades. Harriet Debbie Simmons' killer was behind bars. The nightmare was over. Or so they thought. Detective Karen Whitfield stood on the courthouse steps, letting the cold North Carolina wind sting her cheeks. The trial had been brutal, revisiting every haunting detail of Harriet's last hours, but justice had a way of leaving you both relieved and hollow. She zipped her coat tighter, ready to head back to the precinct, when her phone buzzed. "Unknown number." "Whitfield," she answered, expecting maybe a reporter fishing for a quote. But the voice on the other end was low, hurried, and shaking. "Voice, detective, you don't know me, but you need to listen." Harriet Simmons wasn't the only one. Karen stopped mid-step. "Who is this?" The line crackled. "Voice, Millfield." 1979, there was another girl. Her name was Angela. Same woods. Same summer. Nobody ever found her. Karen's pulse quickened. "Angela who? Give me a last name." Silence. Then a faint, trembling reply. "Voice, I can't, they'll kill me if they know I talked." Click. Karen stared at the darkened phone screen, the hum of traffic fading beneath the pounding of her heartbeat. Millfield Police Department, Evidence Archive, late evening. Karen walked through the narrow aisles of dust-covered boxes, her flashlight cutting through decades of forgotten files. The old 1979 cold case cabinet creaked open, and there it was, a folder she'd never seen before. Angela Reed, missing person. Inside, a single black and white photo of a 19-year-old girl with dark curls and a shy smile. Last seen, July 18, 1979. Report filed by her parents. The notes were sparse, almost careless. There had been no follow-up investigation. As Karen flipped the file closed, something slipped out from the back pocket, a small, yellowing Polaroid. Her breath caught. It was a photo of Angela, but not the smiling teenager from the missing poster. Her expression was frozen in terror. The background? The exact same wooded area where Harriet's body had been found. An unmarked car parked on a quiet suburban street, engine running. Inside, a man in a faded baseball cap watches Karen through binoculars from 2 blocks away. He mutters into a burner phone. "Man, yeah. She's digging. Already found the read file." A distorted voice replies. "Voice, then you know what to do." The man starts the car and pulls away slowly, disappearing into the night. Back at Karen's apartment, later that night. Rain tapped against the windows as Karen sat at her kitchen table, Angela Reed's file spread out before her. She scribbled notes, cross-referenced names, trying to piece together why no one had ever connected Angela's disappearance to Harriet's murder. One name kept showing up in both cases, a former sheriff's deputy, now retired. Karen grabbed her laptop and searched his address. But before she could write it down, a single envelope slid under her apartment door. No knock. No footsteps. She walked over cautiously and picked it up. Inside, one typed sentence. "Stop digging, or you'll end up like them." Karen's stomach dropped. She grabbed her phone and dialed her partner. "Karen, Chris, we've got a problem. Harriet Simmons's case wasn't the end of it. Someone's been cleaning house since '79. And I think Angela Reed's just the beginning." As she spoke, the camera would pan slowly toward her darkened window. Across the street, barely visible in the shadows, a figure watched her, motionless. 40 years later, we thought the monster was locked up. But what if there's more than one?